Hey there, Dengar Stu here. Today's video is about removing the Detroit diesel from the steel trawler and is proudly sponsored by marineengine.com. I've got a few jobs I need to do in the engine room, and I was putting off lifting the motor out because I had this idea I was going to install the crane I own and lift it out on the deck. Turns out that's not really feasible. The crane's not strong enough at the length I need the jib out, and the point loading on the deck's definitely questionable given it's a thin deck. It's not impossible to reinforce the deck and attach that reinforcement to stringers and make it strong enough, but the crane itself's not up to the job. So it's obviously going to be a lot easier to do other jobs like repair the fuel tank and get the prop shaft out if I can move around in there easily. So I'm going to do it first, get it out of the way, make the other jobs easier. Happy days. I've spoken to a mate Rob and he's happy to come down with his crane and lift it out for me. So today is going to be all about undoing the plumbing, the wiring, undoing the engine mounts, getting it ready to lift out, and then hopefully once that's all done I should be able to get him pretty quickly. In hindsight, I wish I'd done this job much earlier on in the project, but you know, live and learn. It's going to be a lot easier to work down there, obviously, with the motor out, and there are certain jobs I just can't do with the motor in. You know, I can't even fit my hand under the motor to do any sort of surface prep or paint the hull below the motor. I can't easily currently get to the port side of the motor, so I'm going to try and clean that up. I'll show you when we get there, but it's also going to mean I can service the motor out of the boat, which means I can maybe do things like changing the front and rear main seals, things that would be quite difficult with it in place. Alright, let's go have a look at what we need to do. I'm actually not 100% sure what this is yet. I'm sure someone will be able to tell me, but I originally thought it was some sort of pump for pumping the oil out to do the oil changes, but it looks more like it's some sort of oil catch can, like a crankcase breather or something like that. Down here we've just got the diesel fuel filter that I'll be upgrading and putting a second one in, as people recommend have two in parallel so you can swap between them and change them at sea if you need to. This one over here is the oil filter, and I'm going to leave that connected to the motor, just take it off the coaming here and have it stay with the motor and just lift the whole thing out together. I think it's going to be easier to deal with on shore than in situ. Then down here we've got the exhaust manifold that has to come off, and our cooling water here. Then we've got our throttle linkage here, gear selector linkage down there, and obviously wiring. I'll also get this bilge pump hose out of the way, and then after that I think we're pretty right to lift it out. Alright, starting in no particular order, I'm just going to take these two wires here for the shut-off solenoid and get this wiring out of the way. The solenoid is labelled positive and negative, and the two wires are colour-coded going to the right side, so it should be easy to get back together. Where possible, I always like to just put screws and things back in so you don't lose them or forget where they go. A lot of this wiring is a bit how you're going. It was all put on with little self-adhesive cable ties. Not great, so I'll redo that. This here is the throttle linkage we adjusted earlier on. Once again, just going to put the clevis pin back and the split pin so I don't lose it. Control cable brackets, just 4 bolts, flatheads. I might replace those too, I hate flatheads. Alright, I'll put these flathead screws somewhere stupid so I make sure I lose them. Once each thing's out, I'm going to try and get it right out of the way so it doesn't get hung up on anything when the motor gets lifted out. Next thing I'll do is undo this bit of hose going to the secondary fuel filter. You can see this hose is perishing and cracking too, so I'll replace all this before it goes back in. This hose clamp here is rotating on the bar, but it's not even that tight. Next thing I'm going to do is disconnect this mysterious sort of catch can type thing, whatever it is. Inside's pretty empty, only a little bit of oil in the bottom, and then down the bottom here is a tap to drain it out, and then there's another larger tap on this side. Anyway, it's bolted through the coaming here, so I'm going to undo this, get it out of the way. I normally rely pretty heavily on having a box of Ziploc bags when I do this type of job. They're at the workshop too, so I might grab a new box before I go too far. Just keep all the bits organised that can't go back where they came from. Looks like this plate supporting the oil filter is welded to the boat, and then it's held on by 6 bolts. Seems a bit excessive, but anyway, we'll get all those undone. I'll get these back ones out first because they're a little bit harder to reach, and just leave it hanging by that one front one till the end. Before the motor comes out, I'll lash that somewhere on the top of the motor so it doesn't get hung up when we lift as well. Alright, I think once I take that bilge pump hose off, that's about all I can get from the top. Then we'll have to jump in. Once this is out, I'm going to have a think about the bilge pump. At the moment it comes here, goes through the coaming into a second hose that just goes overboard out one of the freeing ports. I don't really love that setup, but I can see why it's there because there's not a lot of freeboard to plummet straight out the side, so I don't know, I'll have a think about that too. The plan is to separate the exhaust manifold and pull it to one side and then lift the motor up around it, but I can see there's a coolant hose attaching the exhaust manifold to the engine, so we'll have to take that off too. Looks like my coolant header take's draining out. That's alright. Coolant's got some nice anti-corrosive properties. At least it's green and not rust coloured. That's always a bonus. Okay, next thing I'll get off is this bit of flexible hose from what I think is the raw water intake. I think I'll just wind these clamps until they're completely separated. I won't be reusing them. They're only regular spiral hose clamps and cheap ones at that by the looks of it. I'm going to undo this cover, take it off, then we can wriggle it and get the hose off. It'll also tell me what's in here. Looks like somebody put a bit of grease on these bolts before they installed them, which is making them easier to get out. Oh, that's what's in there, an oyster. Excellent. That was sitting just inside the housing. It's all class. I don't know whether this was just a junction or maybe this is the remnants of an internal anode. I'll have to look in the service manual and figure that out. Alright, let's jump down and have a bit of a recce. Definitely getting too old for this. Alright. Gear shifter linkage, same type of Morse cable as the throttle. Take that off. Oh, and I don't have it today, but I did take your advice. A few people commented and bought a magnetic camera mount, so that apparently arrived at the island today. So from now on it should make filming a bit easier in this space. Eventually I'll replace these seacocks too because they're seized open, but I'll do that once the motor's out. This one seems to come up to here, up towards the header tank. But there's another one on the other side, so I'm not quite sure what the difference is between the two raw water intakes, but we'll figure that out. This bit of flexible junction looks quite swollen. Swelling like this normally happens actually if there's oil getting in touch with the flexible hose, but I'll have to look into that. Could be pressure, could be just oil exposure. This is the start-stop solenoid wire going through some conduit up to the wheelhouse. So we'll leave that to one side. This is our alternator wire, so we'll have to undo this one. This conduit here holds a whole lot of other wires that go up to the wheelhouse, sensors, all that kind of stuff. So I'll get some cutters, we'll get this cable ties off, see where it goes round to the other side, get all that undone. Oh, this is where the hose, this hose here, is the one that goes up to that mysterious thing that I believe to be a catch can. This hose here is quite badly kinked, this hard hose, hard line. That looked actually kinked to be almost blocked off then when I looked at it, so definitely something to look at. We've got a loose belt here that goes to some sort of water pump. I think I'm just going to get cutters and cut it. I can't be bothered squeezing in there and figuring out how it's tensioned. There'll be numbers on it. I'll measure the length, we'll get a new one. I'm not going to put any old items back if they're serviceable. If it's a service item, now's the time to replace it. So I'll cut this belt to the water pump and we'll start doing the electrics here. That's interesting. This belt is actually wedged between this pipe and the pulley. I reckon that was just slipping the whole time. This pump here goes to some sort of manifold over there, which could be deck wash, whatever, but it must have been just slipping on the pulley, because that's really wedged in there. That would be chafing the whole time if that had been running. God knows whether the pump sees too now, but look at the clearance. So, question here. I think what I'm going to do is undo these main bolts and leave the engine mount attached to the motor, because the alternator's attached to the engine mount as well, so I'll leave that. Ooh, no I won't. So I'm leaving the exhaust manifold in place. I think the alternator will hit it. So I think I've got to disconnect the alternator from the engine mount. I think even this engine mount might catch it, so I think I might need to undo these 4 bolts to take the motor off the engine mount rather than the engine mount off the rails. Alright, let's attack the alternator. Wiring, mounting bolts, here's the tensioner, back that off, pivot bolt at the bottom, mounting bolt. Let's get that right out. I actually want to get this either serviced or replaced, because this is it. You know, I'm going to put solar cells in, but this rather small and manky looking alternator is what I'm relying on for power at the moment. And I don't feel like I trust that as far as I can throw it for much longer. Alright, I'm just going to get a photo of the alternator to make reconnection a little bit easier. Alright, got the belt off the tensioner, got the belt off the alternator. Now there's just a bolt here, so just ratchet and span to get this last bolt up. We should better take that out. This wiring loom here goes to the port side that I can't get to easily. So I've got to have a look from above, see what it connects to, and see if we can get everything disconnected. Before I disconnect it though, you can see a classic situation where this is a yellow ring terminal on a green wire going here, and this is a yellow terminal on a green wire going to the alternator. You know, one's longer than the other, so I'll probably watch this video myself when I go to put this back in, but you get the clue straight away that it's not going to be obvious when you come to reinstall this what goes where. Labelling's a great way to go. You know, if you can put a label around it and saying alternator, you know, exciter, alternator positive, whatever it is, then it's completely unambiguous. But can't recommend enough getting as much footage and documentation as you can when you're taking something apart, because what you think is obvious when you're taking it apart is never obvious when you're putting it back together. Remember when I said to you I'm removing the motor because I can't even fit my hand underneath it? Yeah, well, guess where my spanner went. This wire also goes down to that loom, which is some sort of coolant temperature sensor, so disconnect that. While I've been sitting here having a bit of a rest, I've just been looking at this water pipe, and it's a very odd arrangement. It's got this drop down to a smaller diameter, but it was double hose clamped, so I presume it went right over this outer diameter. And the trouble with this sort of reduction is you get a lot of turbulence here, and if ever there's turbulence sort of in a scat between the hose clamps and the end of the pipe, you can actually get a lot of cavitation and you can cause a lot of corrosion. So I might have a look at fixing this pipe before I reconnect it all too. The idea behind cavitation is you end up with a low pressure system that causes essentially vacuum bubbles, and then they collapse quite violently and they start to pit the metal and wear it away. So it actually doesn't look too bad really, but while it's apart, I wouldn't mind fixing it properly. Oh, and the reason the oyster was in here is the pickup on the outside of the hull, the skin fitting, doesn't have a strainer on it at all, so I'm going to look at fitting a proper strainer, a coarse strainer on the hull, and then something a little bit better in between, I think. So this looks like it's the fuel return from the injectors, and it goes to the port tank, so that's good to know. I presume then just through the equalising it goes to the starboard tank, but it's good to know if you're running on the starboard tank only, you're actually going to be filling your port tank with the return fuel as well. Anyway, let's undo this. So down there where the torch is shining is a bracket that supports the exhaust pipe. It looks like it's designed to have 4 bolts, but it's only got 2, so I'll just take those 2 out now. Alright, I'm going to have a go at getting these exhaust manifold bolts off now. I can't fit anything other than a spanner. Actually, the end one I'm only going to get an open-ended spanner in. So I'm just going to give them a bit of a whack. I know you're not supposed to, but hey, works. I promise you I'll never do it with your spanners. Well, this won't be tedious. 1/16 of a turn, swap sides, swap sides. I'll see you in half an hour. With this last stud, the stud came out rather than the nut coming off the stud, and coolant's come out, so I'll have to pop that back in with a bit of sealant on the stud. Anyway, the last one here, the stud's hard up against the manifold, so I think I'll have to undo it a bit, see if I can pry the manifold away from the block and keep undoing it. Otherwise, it's open at the top, so it looks like it's designed exactly for what I'm doing, which is manifold gets pushed away, engine gets lifted straight up. As the nut comes off, it's actually pushing the manifold away. The manifold felt like it might actually drop away when it comes off, so I've tied it up here. Then I'm just going to get this last bolt out here. I'll order a whole service kit for the motor, so we obviously need exhaust gaskets. Alright, next thing I'm going to do is these 4 bolts to get this raw water inlet off. Alright, this pipe's free now. I'm going to take this outlet for the bilge pump off because I think there's a good chance it's just going to break when the motor comes up. It's going to catch it. Anything you can clear that something's going to snag on, just do it now. It's going to be a nightmare later when the crane's here and you're trying to lift it. Down here there's a pipe that goes under the engine mount, so I think I will undo this whole engine mount and take it with me. I won't necessarily do that on all sides, but I think on this side I'll definitely do that. I think the engine mount will catch on this hose though, so I'll undo that and get it right out of the way. I think I'll better reach down and undo that nut with a spanner. I think we'll be right. My big concern now is that all the wiring comes in under this air intake and I can't even see what's going on there. I can't fit in. I don't know. I'm going to have to figure something out. Worst comes to worst, I may have to lift the motor up to a certain height and undo it while it's suspended by the crane. We'll see. Now I'm just going to go down in the bay again with a torch, just have a good look around, see what I can see. I think it's just the wiring left and the actual engine mounts, but I'll just have a double check now. Tide's a little bit high today. I'm starting to change my mind about undoing these bolts because the engine mount rests on here. And if I undo these bolts, there's really nothing supporting the motor from dropping. So I think even though there's a chance this mount will catch up, I think if I pull this exhaust manifold away, it will clear it, just. So a couple of 1-inch nuts to get off, and then I think we're pretty clear. This is the loom we were looking at earlier in the video, and only a single wire continues on to the port side beyond here, and it's the trigger wire for the starter solenoid. So I'll go and see if I can get that off just by feel. Yeah, so now I'm a bit thick, but I've just realised this airbox seems to only have 4 bolts holding it on, which will give me the space I need to squeeze down there, I think. So I'm going to take the 4 bolts off on the back here and see if I can get this airbox off. Bolts are definitely long enough to be mounting bolts, so I think we're going to be in luck. Oh, happy days. That gives me heaps more room. So down there you can see the wires going to the starter solenoid and a few other wires connecting below, but should be able to fit in there now. Alright, we're in. It was still quite hard to squeeze past this wet exhaust, but here we are. Air intake could certainly use a clean up. Positive wire from the battery, power pickup, negative I'm presuming. This is the trigger wire, the red one here for starting, and this is just an earth strap here that can stay. These 2 wires aren't colour coded, they're both black, so I'm going to have to attach them to each other or something, make it obvious which one goes where. I'll just knot that bit of tape through the positives. So, 2 positives taped together, 2 negatives loose. Note to self. Alright, little trigger wire. Alright, the only thing stopping me pulling this loom back round to the starboard side now is one cable tie. Don't really feel like squeezing out and finding some cutters, so I'm just going to see if I can break it somehow. Alright, cable tie gone. So this is the loom free now. I'm going to change back to the original plan. The nut here for the engine mount hits the flange here before it's even close to off, which would mean jacking the motor up slowly and getting it off. It's supported on the other 3 corners, so I'm just going to undo these 2 and see how much it drops. Alright, only a couple of millimetres is the answer, so that's good. One last thing I need to take off now is the hose going from the engine into the exhaust. So I'll disconnect that from the other end, and I think that should be it. Alright, that's the water hose off. Looks like it could use a bit of TLC anyway, so we'll get into that too. Alright, next thing I'm going to do is just take the awning off so we can get the crane in. Rob's on his way down now with the crane. My only real fear is that it gets hung up on the mounting bolts somehow when we end up lifting the boat off the stand, so that's what I'll be keeping an eye out for the most, and then we'll settle it on the ground on some blocks. Alright, now it's out. Tomorrow I'm going to jump back down the engine room, start cleaning it out properly, let it dry, and then I'm going to push on and start making the side door. So I'll catch you in a few days. See ya.